And if Melitopol falls from the Russian perspective, it not only isolates Crimea, but it isolates all Russian forces west of that, which they can't cross the Dnieper River. So it's starting to isolate pockets of Russian forces, which is what Ukraine did in Kherson last summer, which proved highly effective.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. And today we are joined by Ed Arnold. Ed Arnold is a research fellow for European security at the defence think tank RUSI. As an infantry officer in the British Army, he's been deployed to Afghanistan and East Africa, and he was posted at the Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers Europe during the 2014 Ukraine crisis. Ed Arnold, welcome. Thank you for your time today. Now, in the last few days, we've seen Ukrainian forces retake Robotyne. It's a small village, but it has significant strategic importance, doesn't it?
Yes, I think politically it is the first sort of large settlement that Ukraine have been able to retake in their counteroffensive. So it's obviously an immediate morale boost. And actually in the last couple of days, you can almost sense the fact that the narrative is changing of the sort of some negative views of the Ukrainian counteroffensive wasn't moving at the speed that people expected, which is, I think, quite wrong in my opinion, that people had sort of inflated views of what they were able to do. You must remember that they're not doing this with the requisite air power that a NATO army would do with this. So I think immediately there is a political significance, but actually militarily, I mean, it marks the first line of Russian defences of three. And it opens up movement further south, specifically to Tokmak, which is around 20 kilometres away, and then Melitopol, sort of 70 kilometres further south. So this looks like the most likely axis of four that Ukraine have managed to open, where they can start to try and push through and really sever that land corridor that the Russians were able to establish after the invasion last year.
And one's often attempted to count the progress of the counteroffensive in terms of kilometres and area gained on the ground. How much further, though, do you think Ukrainian forces need to push to really make a difference?
Well, we're starting to see it now, and ultimately what Ukraine need to do is further degrade the Russian fighting spirit effectively. And you're absolutely right that we can't just measure this in kilometres retaken. It's far more important of where those kilometres are and what they actually allow the Ukrainians to do on the ground. And what we're seeing is the front line is pushing further and further south in Ukraine's favour. And what that provides is range. Ukraine are using ranged weapon systems very effectively to degrade Russian high-value targets like command and control, ammunition stores, significantly sort of transport routes, major routes that the Russians use to move. So as that line moves further south, it starts to allow more of those targets to be in range, not just of those long-range rocket systems, but critically sort of 152, 155 millimeter artillery that can mass. And that's where the Russian forces will continually degrade. What Ukraine's hoping for is sort of, as the breakthrough starts to happen, sort of gradually, and then suddenly it will open up Ukrainian options going forward.
Because it has been suggested that Ukrainian forces don't even need to get as far as the Sea of Azov to make a real difference, in so much as that if they can get close enough to actually bring within range the rail and train routes and cut off the supplies, then that will be enough. And they may not even need to go all the way down to the coast to achieve what they need to.
Exactly, and what they're trying to do is effectively get fire control over these areas. So Tokmak, very important, and will be in range very soon, if not already. And that's a major railway hub, and there's one major railway that runs across the corridor, and then the other one is the M14 highway, which runs along the coast from Mariupol through to Melitopol. So as soon as Ukraine are able to comfortably interdict Russian forces on that line, it really sort of constrains where the Russians go. Same as Melitopol. I mean, if Melitopol falls from a Russian perspective, it not only isolates Crimea, but it isolates all Russian forces west of that, which they can't cross the Dnieper River. So it's starting to isolate pockets of Russian forces, which is what Ukraine did in Kherson last summer, which proved highly effective.
And if that happens, if and when that happens, what position does that leave Russian forces in?
Well, very difficult. And also the other part of this is really the Kerch Bridge, which connects Crimea to Russia. and Ukraine have shown that they have the capacity and opportunity and ultimately capability to target the bridge, but they haven't managed to destroy it completely. Very difficult to destroy a bridge. But if they can start to control movement across that bridge as well, it ultimately means that the Russians will not be able to reinforce properly, and in some areas they won't be able to withdraw properly. And I think what Ukraine wants to try and do is, instead of fighting for all of this territory, they want to isolate Russian forces and ultimately try and push a surrender. We'll actually see what happens with Tokmak and Melitopol, because Tokmak will be very important to go in and actually secure it on the ground and secure that railway link. The issue is urban fighting is very slow and it's very bloody. Ukraine needs to reserve its force. In terms of Melitopol, they don't even need to necessarily go into Melitopol. They can just bypass the city itself and just cut it off further east, and then essentially just strangle Russian forces over the winter. This is how Ukraine really needs to operate, because they just don't have the resources to press ahead in any other way, which has unnecessary risk.
How much strategic guidance are NATO military leaders giving Ukraine at the moment?
A lot of guidance, and I think that is well received. But the issue it really is, from the NATO context, is the advice versus the training. Now, the advice, and the Supreme Allied Commander Europe recently visited, but with his US European Command hat on. He was also joined by the UK Chief of the Defence Staff to start to look at defence planning and sort of provide that high level advice and try and understand what the planning is for the next phase of the operation going into winter, and also the next fighting season, which will start from spring next year. The real issue at the moment is also the training aspect from NATO forces, and there has been criticism, which again unwarranted in my opinion, that Ukraine is sort of wasting the NATO training that it's receiving. But NATO fights in a very certain way. It wants to do combined arms maneuver. It wants to do it at scale. The conditions are just not really there on the ground for Ukraine to do that. Like I said previously, NATO would do, if they were undertaking this type of operation, it'd be months of shaping activity through air power before ground forces even started to maneuver. And Ukraine do not have that. So Ukraine really needs to fight this operation how they believe they need to fight this operation.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because Ukraine, the support it's given, the training it's given, at the end of the day, they're the ones that got to do the fighting, and they're the ones that got to do it the way they see they can do it the best.
Absolutely. And also how they integrate new recruits who are receiving, 5, 6, 7 weeks of training within the UK and Germany as well before they move to the front line. They need to integrate them with units. In some cases, they've been fighting since 2014, but have obviously taken severe casualties from those more experienced soldiers. So it's a real balance, an issue in it. Ukraine is not in a great place there. There are challenges, but they are slowly overcoming them. On the Russian side, all of those challenges are far, far worse.
Yeah, in terms of Ukrainian recruitment, how do you see it at the moment? Because Ukraine obviously has a reputation for wanting to take care of its soldiers. The longer this war goes on, the more pressure there will be to get new recruits. Do you think there's obviously not an unlimited supply?
No, but I think in terms of, we have to look at this in two things: numbers overall, which generally appear to be good, and there is an ability for Ukraine to draw on more if required. The issue is that they are not volunteers by now. They are people who are called up to serve. And the real problem is quality, in terms of quality of, specifically combat, but also operational experience. And as Ukrainian and also Russian forces degrade, the issue is how to absorb new recruits. And the training that is being provided by the EU, by the UK, by the US, and it's all very valuable because it's giving all these troops sort of basic infantry skills, but they are very basic. And the issue is it's very difficult to do complex offensive operations with the quality of those types of forces. But it's far easier to defend. And that's actually what we've been seeing on the Russian side, that the Russians have actually been able to operate far more effectively in the defense than the offense. But for maneuver to happen and sort of large changes on maps to happen very quickly, you need very, very skilled forces. I think for Ukraine, it's a question now of whether they actually almost have two tracks where they use the winter to actually train at a higher formation and get better quality soldiers and keep them fresh off the front line to invest sort of in February, March next year in greater quantities. That is an option open to them.
And I'm just interested to know what kind of troop movements you've seen both on the Russian and Ukrainian side, and give us an idea of the way this war is going, because we're hearing about Russian elite troops being moved from the Kherson and Luhansk regions to support Russia's defensive efforts in the Zaporizhia and the Bakhmut areas.
Yeah, and the issue for both sides is this is a very wide front, and the forces have to sort of maneuver to absorb attacks and sort of across that whole front line. And really what needs to happen is the Russians need to defend against the assessed Ukrainian main effort. And that's been quite difficult up until now because they've been pressing on sort of four sides, one in the east and three in the south. But now what it sees is that the Western approach now that is starting to move south at a greater pace, that is probably the most likely point where the Ukrainians are going to put their reserve forces in and ultimately try and breach the Russian lines, get behind the lines, and then move to the land bridge. So what we're likely to see is far more movements from both sides now in terms of where to invest. The issue for the Russians is they're moving laterally across a defensive line where Ukraine are holding their reserves more centrally, so they can probably make a difference much quicker. The other point is now in terms of that range that the Russians can only really move via rail or road, and that rail and road route in the south is very quickly getting into the sort of the interdiction capability of Ukrainian forces. And if Ukraine are able to do the targeting, and there's no suggestion why they can't, because their targeting has been very effective, they're going to start to look for that operational reserve and try and destroy it before it can get into the defensive lines.
So do you really believe then that we're at a turning point in the war?
Yes, and I think the counteroffensive was always going to be gradual, and then there would most likely be sudden movements. I don't think that Ukraine has the ability to recapture all of its territory this year, and I don't actually think that was likely on the cards, and it certainly wasn't in terms of the delay of a lot of equipment being supplied from the West. But like I said, that they have done the best that they can without air power, and this is kind of what an operation would look like if you were trying to do it without air power. But where they are now, if they can press home their advantage where they are at the moment in the next 2 months and really try and get control as close to Melitopol as possible, the conditions are probably okay for them to fight a little bit more into the winter to get to a set part. The real issue across the whole front line is where Ukraine sets its limits of exploitation and actually goes on the defensive as well, because they're going to have to start to dig in and create defensive lines as well, because Russia may be able to get or regenerate the capability to do offensive operations after the winter, similar to how they attempted to do it this year.
Yeah, and we see them trying to do that on the Eastern Front at the moment, notably reports this week of them using Kamikaze drones to do so. Are those just very small movements in your view?
Well, there's been reports of, up to 100,000 and sort of 900 tanks being sort of redeployed to the Lyman-Kupiansk sort of salient, which seems quite inflated from what the Russians might be able to sort of get. I mean, in the East, a Russian official sort of war objective is to still capture the Donbass. So regardless of protecting the land bridge down south in Crimea, they still want to manage to get the whole of the Donbass, which means they still have to move on offensive operations. But actually, this sort of presence of a lot of drone activities, suicide drone activity in the East actually suggests that they just don't have the ammunition to go on the offense. So really, they're using those drones to disrupt Ukrainian activity and try and again fix it so that Ukrainians can't redeploy anything further south as well. But it's highly likely that all of their sort of artillery ammunition especially is in Bakhmut and south of Bakhmut as well, which actually will not enable Russian offensive operations, but it will fix Ukrainian forces and cause them some issues within the east.
A few months back, you brought us a report on how, despite a terrible start in the war, Russian forces had learned from early mistakes on the battlefield. How well do you think they are being commanded now?
It's very difficult to assess, and actually Russian command has been poor throughout the war, and it started off very poorly in the sense that a lot of the troops there were not actually told that they were going on an operation. A lot of them thought it was an exercise. They were not told their objectives, which meant they were not able to fully prepare. And that's a large part of why that sort of special military operation failed. They had better command in the south throughout, just because of General Sorokin was in the south at that point, and also the ground was slightly easier. In the east, it has never been good, and it's still very, very difficult. The issue is there's no real unity of command because the Russian forces are made up of regulars, militia, and mercenary units, and we have seen the real political issues that come with that at the same time. And also a lot of senior military commanders have either been killed, incapacitated, or removed. So this is very different Russian force to the one that was started, the invasion last February. But actually, in terms of their defensive operations, how they were able to plan and site their defenses, digging in, use of minefields, has actually been very good. And in the defense, which is easier from an operational standpoint, their doctrine actually kind of worked on the ground. And that's why we've seen an improvement. But I don't think that improvement is in terms of Russian command. I think it's in terms of the task, and the ground has made it easier for Russian forces to perform.
So in that light, do you think that the disappearance of Yevgeny Prigozhin, who was an outspoken critic of the way the war was going, and with his failed mutiny, the fact that Valery Gerasimov, the chief of the general staff, has now not got someone like him challenging him, and neither has the defense minister, does that not actually provide an opportunity? And with the number of high-level commanders who've just disappeared, if they've stepped out of line and criticised anything, does that actually make little difference?
I think it makes a little difference, and while it sort of removes sort of some high-level political issues, especially for Gerasimov and Shoigu, it also means that the focus is firmly on men. That there's no one else in terms to say, well, the war is not, well, we haven't succeeded on this operation because of Wagner, etc. So actually, it also shines a spotlight on them, and they've obviously been protected from this. So they need to really effectively create military victories in terms of battles, and then also the Russian position on the ground. So while it strengthens them in the short term, there are still real issues. And then there is also this sort of large question mark over what happens to the Wagner group now that Prigozhin's dead. And of course, it's not just that Prigozhin's dead. The entire leadership team of Wagner was on the same plane. So at the moment, they are effectively leaderless. And in the short term, an effective leader needs to come through very, very quickly, or that group could splinter. For the Russians on the ground, one of the issues is that they've actually lost the numbers that Wagner provided, which was actually critical in many circumstances, especially the battle for Bakhmut. Some could be co-opted into the Russian regular military, and also they have skills that could be used by other mercenary groups. Wagner is a group, and there's other mercenary groups, so it's not certain whether we'll still see those numbers on the front line in Ukraine at any time soon, or they're going to focus on other theatres, training in Belarus, or also to support Wagner operations in Africa. We just don't know.
What do you think the state of the morale of the Russian troops is at the moment? Because you said before that the use of these kamikaze drones on the Eastern Front may be a sign of the running out of ammunition, and we've seen the Chief of General Staff visiting Russian front lines in the south, although I'm not sure he actually saw them face to face. Battle fatigue, ammunition shortages, is this having an impact on Russian troops? What do you know about that?
It absolutely is. And I mean, one of the astounding things that I've sort of viewed from the war is sort of Russian morale and how it sort of still is able to operate. I mean, the important point on this is that morale from the Russian side didn't start at sort of 100%. I mean, they were on the border for a long time before they went in as well, in terms of their troops. Like I previously said, that they were actually told their objectives in terms of the special military operation. And then it's really been setback after setback. There was some sort of battles where the morale increased last summer, where Russia was slowly moving forward, but they were also then sort of they all went backwards when Ukraine had a very successful counteroffensive in the east and then south. And from there, I mean, the Russians increased operational tempo early this year, but effectively got nowhere. And as winter starts to set in again, that is where morale really weakens from a military standpoint. For Ukraine, the morale is still relatively high because they know that they're going to go on offensive operations, and they are very, very clear about their objectives. On the Russian side, they're not. And the thought of sort of digging in for another long, cold winter, not knowing if you're going to go back on the offensive, is going to be a pretty difficult proposition for sort of Russian forces on the ground.
Do you know what the winter looks like? Is it likely to be the scenario that it will be quiet on the front, but we are going to see increased activity, perhaps drone activity inside Russia itself, more targeting of grain silos that's in Ukraine, and more attacks on the energy sources by the Russian side? What do you see will be the movement in terms of tactics?
Yeah, no, I think it will be sort of as you describe, and the model to look to is sort of last winter as well. I mean, this is going to be a war that is characterized by fighting seasons. The fighting season, your fighting will not stop, but it slows down. But however, I think this winter, because of where the position that Ukraine is likely to be, we're going to probably see more activity. So again, not big changes on the map, but that gradual degradation of Russia's ability to fight. So the targeting behind lines. Ukraine are obviously trying to develop a long-range drone capability that can strike deep inside Russia, which sort of brings the war home to the Russian society. And ultimately, they will be looking at the high-value target list across all of those constituent parts and seeing where they can best have an effect. And one of the areas that they will be looking at, which they were not necessarily able to do last year, is to focus on Russian engineering assets, which were able to put these defenses up in the first place. They are very high value targets. Ultimately, if you take out trench digging equipment, etc., then the Russians will not be able to fill or create as good defensive barriers in the first place. So they're certainly going to be a higher priority than they were last year.
What kind of progress do you think Ukraine needs to make in the counteroffensive before the winter sets in for it to make a sort of tangible difference in how long this war lasts?
Well, if the operation now in the south is going well and they're going to start to push further south, if they can get control over Melitopol and slightly further south in terms of their artillery range, I think that will be good outcome at the moment. They're not going to be able to take back the amount of territory that they wanted to this year, but I don't think that was ever a realistic prospect. But what they critically need to do is convince the Western backers, of which there are many, to say, well, we can do this potentially next year as well. And I think there's enough political support at the moment for that to be a realistic possibility. But the issue is, further than that, big question mark. There's also a big question mark in terms of political changes next year, most notably in the US presidential election, and then a number of other Western nations as well are going through their electoral cycles and sort of natural progressions. And that's really the key at the moment, that Ukraine needs to show their Western backers, like they did last year, towards the end of the summer, but the support in terms of the natures of the equipment, main battle tanks, and also fighters now in the form of F-16s. These decisions are always sort of taken at the last safe moment from a political standpoint in the West, and then it takes a long period to train. So there's a real lag when they're announced to when they actually get into service, and then when they can actually be integrated into Ukrainian units. Hopefully we've learned that lesson now and actually much better prepare Ukraine over this winter for a fighting season that starts as soon as the weather allows, not like this year where they had to wait a couple of additional months, which has just compacted their timelines.
And just finally, Ed, the UK Defence Secretary, Ben Wallace, has announced his resignation. He was a really strong supporter of Ukraine and its forces. His replacement, Grant Shapps, has said that he will support the war in Ukraine? Isn't it a case of just, well, he would say that anyway, wouldn't he? I mean, is there any kind of consolation? Is there any kind of hope that can be gathered from those kind of statements?
Well, I think policy continuity for the UK in support of Ukraine is very high. So actually, I don't think it matters who the defence secretary is, and actually looking longer term, who the party in power is. I think UK support to Ukraine, which we have done since 2015 under Operation Orbital and has significantly increased in the last 2 years, makes it relatively automatic in terms of the support given. The defense secretary, the outgoing defense secretary, there are big shoes to fill. He was credited with very early support to Ukraine at the start of last year's invasion and critically influenced other nations to do the same. He's travelled extensively to allied capitals to sort of keep that support going, and that's something that Grant Shapps will need to continue to do. And ultimately, while Ukraine is very important to the UK at the moment, and the first 2 paragraphs in Ben Wallace's resignation letter are about Ukraine. The UK defence has lots and lots of other issues that needs a lot of close attention to. Although for where the UK is at the moment, we've sort of gone through our review cycle in 2021 and we've just published refreshes of our defence command paper. So actually, in terms of his current role, is the thinking has been done. This is all about delivery now. This is all about tangible outcomes. And that's ultimately what Grant Shapps will be measured against.
Ed Arnold, it's been great speaking to you. Thank you very much for your time. You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio. My thanks to Louis Sykes, our producer. To support the work of Frontline, hit the subscribe button. You can also listen to Times Radio throughout the day or read it at times.co.uk. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.